Hello, and welcome to this episode of QI Corner. I am 1031 Broker James, along with me, my host, Greg Burns of IPX 1031. Today, we are going to talk about the 5 ways you can ruin a 1031 exchange. I know that this is probably not the most positive way to look at it. We could talk about the 5 ways to ensure that you don't ruin, but so many exchanges fail every year, and these are the top 5 reasons why they fail.
Okay.
So, you ready to dive into this, Greg? Because I know you've got some humdinger stories on what people have done.
I don't like to give bad news, but I guess we gotta address it. So let's do it.
So the first one is one that's actually pretty common. I've run up against it, and that is missing the 45-day deadline. So we know that 45-day clock starts the day after close. When you sell that relinquished property, you close, and you've already engaged your accommodator. That is going to be another one that we're going to talk about, but you've already done everything right up to this point. Day 1 after close is day 1 of the 45-day clock. I've come across where I've been referred to people already in that identification period, and they think that their 45 days are business days, not calendar days.
Yeah, I would say of the exchanges that fail, that's probably like the number one reason why. I mean, the reality of it is in any market, great deals get multiple offers and good deals sell. And I've been doing this for 26 years. You've been doing it for a very long time. And you know, that's kind of true. Like you come across a deal that comes on the market and you're like, this deal's going to be gone tomorrow, right? Like it's going to get multiple offers. You know it, right? You can tell your customer when you send them that deal, hey, this is a very good deal. They're going to get multiple offers. We need to come in if you want to buy it with a very strong offer. So I would say, you know, finding a property you want to buy within 45 days is definitely the most challenging part, and certainly why probably of the exchange that we have that fail probably is because 90% of them probably because of 45 days. So, you know, what advice that I always give my customers is be aggressive early in the transaction. Try to get something under contract and into escrow as quickly as you can so that you're not kind of bumping up against that 45 days. I know that you many times have been called in deals because we've talked about it where you get called in 2 weeks or a week before the 45 days is up and saying like, hey, can you find the property? So, and then you're in, scramble mode.
Yeah, I have one client that I am now forever on their Christmas card list because I was brought in. They had less than 14 days left to identify. I was able to help them successfully find a great exchange option, and they're very happy. So, yeah, but that's, like you said, finding the good deals, there's going to be competition with those good deals. Yeah. I had a case, actually it wasn't my case. I had a fellow agent, residential agent, that she owned single family home rentals. And it was back a few years ago, right before COVID, when market was hot. In fact, even right up until 2020. And somebody made her an offer she couldn't refuse on one of her rental properties. And so she did everything right and went out and identified 3 more single family home rentals. Problem is that this is at the time when people were buying houses and closing. Not only were they closing quick, but they were offering hundreds, if not millions of dollars over ask here in LA County. And she got blown out on all 3 deals that she identified, and her exchange failed. And so the message to people there is there's a reason why they give you 3 options or 3 properties to identify, which, by the way, that's not the only identification rule. There are 2 others. We won't get into that now. But if you're going to use that 3 property rule, which you would say 90% of people use, right? That 3rd option should be a fallback. Pick 2 solid and then have that 3rd one be something that, hey, if these 2 don't go, at least we've got a great backup plan, which is usually a DST is usually a great option for that 3rd option. And hopefully you're identifying a DST that is in alignment with your other 3 properties that you're exchanging with. I have a funny story about that. We won't get into that either. So I was going to ask you, so when you see people fail they just don't identify in 45 days, what would you say the common reason for that is?
Usually lack of motivation. I mean, typically clients that like are really actively looking for property and are really aggressively looking for property, they don't really run into exchange issues. They typically can get it done. It's usually people that are like, oh, I closed, but we're going to be gone for 2 weeks on vacation. And when I get back, I'll start looking. They're just not really aggressively pursuing properties. So I would say that's a majority. And some of the clients, like I open deals all the time where clients are like, listen, your fee is $1,000. I'm just going to open an exchange, look for 45 days. If I can find something I can't live without, great, I'm going to buy it. But if I can't, I'm just going to cash out. And so they've kind of, opened an exchange as a way to kind of buy themselves some additional time just to make sure there's nothing out there that they just can't live without.
Interesting. I find that really surprising. That just tells me that you and I need to sit down and have a lunch and strategize, because those are people that I could help. But what I find, and this kind of ties into that, is that, people close and they're not even really sure what they want to exchange into. They have an idea, like those clients you're talking about, they have an idea where, on my channel and the way I coach everybody is like, look, you should be clear on what you want to look for really before you even put that relinquished property on the market. You should have a really good idea. Like, we're going to sell this and we want to exchange into multifamily. Okay,
Right.
well, let's start looking at multifamily assets that fit while we're putting your property on the market. So it comes down to really having that plan and mapping out your exchange ahead of time. All right, number 2, you fail to clearly identify your properties.
Yeah, we don't see that many challenges with those. I typically sometimes you'll be buying like a triple net lease investment and it won't, at the time of your identification period, maybe the address is not available because it's brand new construction. And so you want to make sure that you do everything you can to kind of identify that asset. I had a client that was buying a McDonald's that had not been completed yet. And in the marketing package, the address was a certain address, which is what they identified. And then they ended up once the county or the city issued an address for the property, it was different. It was like 1 or 2 digits off. And so they got audited and the IRS said, oh, well, you didn't properly identify this property. And then the broker had to say, well, listen, we identified it as a McDonald's. Here's the marketing package for it. Here's the internet marketing package for it. Like, we clearly identified this property. I would say our biggest fail in those types of situations is when someone is like, I got a client right now that has 2 separate exchanges open, right? Because there's 2 different entities that have sold 2 separate replacement properties. And he's going to use the proceeds from both properties to purchase a replacement property. Well, so each one of those entities is not going to buy 100% of, that property. So they've got to identify basically a tenant in common interest for each of those exchanges to make sure that they've clearly identified that property. Now, that's kind of getting a little bit picky, but we're trying to do everything we can to mitigate any questions if there's ever an audit. So if you're not buying 100% of it, like in a DST, you mentioned that kind of earlier, you definitely want to make sure that you identify the interest that you're buying in that property or properties.
Same as I've seen people identify, they're buying a single family condo to rent and they give the address to the condo complex, but not specifically to the unit.
Yeah.
So, and I have done some triple net deals that were brand new construction where, the address does not match. And so I talked with you on one, and another accommodator's like, look, I'm going to give you the parcel number because that we know is correct.
Yeah. That works.
All right. Number 3 is, and this has never happened to me, thank goodness, is missing the 180-day deadline. Typically in my world, like I said, I've got people where we're identifying properties. In fact, I've even got a client right now, we're writing offers and they're still in escrow. The money went hard on their deal. We know when they're closing, but I'm writing LOIs right now on possible replacement properties that once they close and we get in, there's no debt on it. It's an all cash deal. We'll probably close inside their 45-day identification period. That's pretty common. I would say 70% of my exchange clients close within their 45 days. So we get them done, get them in there, get them done quick. So there's no headache or stress over, are we going to close on time?
Yeah, on the East Coast and in the Midwest, our exchange periods are a little bit longer, but on the West Coast, our exchange periods are relatively short. I mean, it's a little bit more than 60 days is the average exchange file that we have open. So I would agree with you on both points that you kind of made, which is one, you need to make sure that you go into your exchange with a plan in place of what you're trying to accomplish by selling this asset. Like, why are we selling it? What are we trying to do? Are we trying to reduce management responsibilities? Are we doing it for geographic reasons? Are we trying to build a portfolio? Right? These are all questions that you have, discussions you have with your customer before you even list the property for sale. And then the other thing is be aggressive, right? So you're talking about, hey, we're not closed yet, but we're going to make some LOIs. And once we're past contingencies on your sale, or you're maybe even a couple of weeks, a week or so away from closing, we'll get this thing under contract so we can immediately get your money, out of your QI and back into the market where it's making money for you, where you're collecting rent. So we do occasionally bump up against that 180-day period. Usually it's based on a lender issue where they run into some lender problems where they can't get the deal closed. And the rules for the 180 say, hey, you've got to acquire the economic benefits and burdens of ownership within that 180-day period. So, and the reason it says that, and it doesn't talk about a recorded deed to the title to the property, because all the deed does is put the world on notice that you have superior title to that property. But in some states, they don't record the deed till weeks after the property's actually closed and the benefits and burdens have passed over to the new buyer. So there are ways, and we could talk about that in another, QI corner, where you can actually acquire the economic benefits and burdens of ownership and not actually, get a recorded deed to the property. So there are kind of ways that we can get around that.
Yeah, I've actually heard of a couple cases that got really, in fact, I remember one now that when you brought up the lender, that because of lending issues, the 180 days passed. I don't remember how that all came together, but I do remember they ran up against a lender issue. They just didn't have the right lender, which, again, all the more reason why you need to plan things out, especially if you're going to be replacing debt. You need to really start your process early because, especially in today's landscape with lenders, they want so much information. And there's so much that you need to make sure that you are covering your bases on to make sure that you're giving everybody plenty of time to complete your transaction.
Yeah, I would agree with you that that's something that the clients overlook is on the lending side, right? Which is like they just assume that they can get a new loan and they don't realize that the lending criteria, from 3 years ago or 5 years ago when they purchased their building is very different. So it's important to, have those discussions about what you're trying to accomplish, but also to make sure that you can get a loan because and I've seen it happen to multiple clients over the years where they sold their property, they're in a 1031, they're under contract on their purchase, and they can't get a loan. Yep. So they are, stuck. A lot of those people end up going into DSTs, but some people get stuck because they're past their 45 days. They didn't identify a DST, and so they are done for.
Yep. It's so heartbreaking to me when I hear some of these stories and people's like, oh, that could have been avoided. It really could have been avoided. Next two, number 4 and number 5, there's some parallels to them. Number 4 is closing before you engage an accommodator. So we kind of talked about that off camera. The general rule is that, look, when you are in escrow and you know that the earnest money's gone hard, you know that this buyer is going to execute on this close, that's when you should engage your QI. Is engage the QI, get the paperwork done so that when you do close, the money from escrow seamlessly goes to your accommodator. Quick, clean, and easy. Comments?
Yeah, I mean, my opinion is whether you're doing a forward exchange where, your sale closes, the money comes to the QI, or you're doing a reverse exchange where you're buying the property that you want before you sell the property that you have to get the exchange set up before the sale, either the sale or your purchase closes. So it's really important. They're very easy to get set up, but we do have clients, and many times they maybe thought about doing an exchange or they didn't know about an exchange. And then they find out, after they close, because they're getting this 1099, that they've got all this tax liability. And they're like, oh, well, I didn't know I was going to have this, I need to do an exchange. And once you close, it's too late because at that point, you're basically in control of the funds.
Yeah. So interestingly enough, the case that we mentioned earlier about the 14 days, actually, no, I'm sorry. This was a different case because it was the taxpayer I was referred to was closing in 5 days. The CPA called me and said, James, I've got a client for you. He desperately needs to exchange. He just learned what his tax liability is going to be, and it's going to be north of $350,000, and he lost his mind. So you may want to wait to call him till tomorrow because he's really hot right now. And I said, no, I need to call him today. If he's closing in 5 days, I need to get him hooked up with a QI, because if we don't get that done before he closes, then he's going to come looking for you, because he's going to end up owing that $350K. Yeah. Again, part of the plan. I tell people, look, as soon as you decide that you want to sell an investment property, I mean, that moment when you're like, you talk to your partners, you talk to your spouse, you say, you know what, I think it's time to sell it. Your very next call should be to your CPA. The very next call should be to your CPA. You need to get clear on what is my tax implication if I sell this property.
Yeah.
All right. So the number 5, which kind of falls in line with what we're talking about here, is taking possession of your exchange funds. So they're obviously, I don't know why they call it exchange funds at that point, but it's really when you take possession of your proceeds after the close. They call it constructive.
Yeah, obviously, if you get the money, so IRS uses the term constructive receipt. It says you can't have constructive receipt during the exchange period. The exchange period starts the date that escrow closes. So there's kind of some interesting deals when it comes to that. But there are some times where, you may be involved in a deal and the earnest money deposit is going to be released to the seller prior to the close of escrow. And in most cases, when that happens, they send that money to us, right? So let's say after contingencies are removed, buyers got a $200,000 earnest money deposit. And once contingencies are removed, they're going to release that money to the seller, right? Well, most of the time that money gets sent to us. And the nice thing about that is that the seller can kind of go use that money to go shop for replacement properties and use that money as a deposit. But we have had deals where the seller has actually taken possession of them. And a lot of times people think, oh, well, they've already taken possession of these funds. They're now in constructive receipt of these monies. They can't exchange it. But remember that the exchange period doesn't start till the date that escrow closes on the sale. So as long as they return those funds to escrow prior to it closing and the monies get funneled to the QI, I think that they're okay.
Right. And we also discussed offline too, is that if they do take the money, because a lot of times when this happens is they haven't engaged a QI yet. And so they get the earnest money deposit, because I had a client that did this. They got a $150,000 check in the mail. They deposited it in their bank and proceeded to pay off some debt. And I told him, I said, look, that's not going to DQ your 1031, but you are going to pay the capital gains tax on that. It's boot, right?
Right. Yep. Yeah, we do have clients that do partial exchanges where they take that earnest money deposit and they say, hey, I'm okay paying taxes on it, which is fine. So they take that money, they use it to do whatever they're going to do with it, and they report it as they've taken $200,000 from their sale, and they pay taxes on those funds.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, though, constructive receipt, because this is something that it's actually been happening a lot, and at least I've been hearing about it a lot lately. For some reason, there's a lot of people that think that constructive receipt is, well, they don't know the definition of constructive receipt. They just hear possession. As long as I don't take possession, I'm good. And that's not the case. So already just in this year, there's been at least 3 or 4 cases I've heard of where people closed, did not engage an accommodator, didn't touch the money, but the money was because they left it with the escrow company. Mm-hmm. Now, there's a part of me that goes, well, if an escrow company is holding on to money, escrow should be asking them, why are we holding on to it? Some escrow companies, we all know, some are much better than others. But the person is telling escrow, hold on to that money because I'm going to do an exchange.
Yeah, usually the escrow officer will say like, hey, we can't hold your money as part of a 1031. You've got to send it to the accommodator. But it does happen, right? And constructive receipt doesn't mean actual receipt of the funds. It means control. That's why, like in a simultaneous exchange, let's say when people, like it happens, people ask me this question all the time. Like, hey, I'm even using the same escrow officer. They're handling my sale and my purchase. My sale is going to close, and then I'm going to use those proceeds to immediately close on my purchase. Do I need a QI? You do. Because guess what? When your sale closes, the only person that can direct those funds to the purchase, if you don't have a QI, is the taxpayer, is the seller. And then you're in control of the money. So in those types of situations, we drop exchange docs on both sides, and then we send an authorization letter to the escrow officer authorizing them to send money from one file directly to the other, or if they're different escrow officers, from one escrow directly to the other escrow. But constructive receipt means control. So you're right. Once escrow closes, it doesn't matter if they actually have the funds. At that point, at any point, they could call the escrow officer and say, send me my money. So they're clearly in constructive receipt of those funds. That's why there are special rules on, when accommodators or qualified intermediaries can send back money to customers, right? When the sale closes and the proceeds come to us, the very first time that we could send it back is on day 46, right? So they have 45 days to identify. And on day 46, if they have not identified any property, they have a failed exchange, we could send them their money back. And so there are a couple of different rules that come with when we can send related, funds back to the customer. And they're kind of a little bit funky, but it makes it clear that the client's not in constructive receipt or control the money during the exchange period.
Right. So you bring up something that I think will also make a great episode for a QI Corner: simultaneous exchange. I didn't think those really happened anymore. I'm sure they're very rare, but you still do those?
Yeah. I mean, we still have clients. I'm doing one, right now where a client's going to, close on the sale and the purchase are going to go. So what happens typically in those deals is they're almost kind of like a reverse exchange, where the client's gone out and found the property that they want before they've even sold the property that they have. And so they're telling the buyer or the seller of that property that they're trying to buy, hey, you know what? I've got this property that's for sale, and I will close on your purchase right after I get this thing closed. But yeah, there are some simultaneous deals that exist. Not a lot of them, but there are some.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for tuning in to this episode of QI Corner and the 5 ways to ruin your exchange. Hopefully you took some great notes. Be sure to like, subscribe, make comments. We'd love to hear from you. Greg, thanks again. And thank you to everybody else for being with us. We'll see you next time on the QI Corner.
All right. Sounds good.